Thank you very much, Jin Rong, and hello everybody. It's really nice to be here. So yeah, I'm going to pick up on a couple of things that William mentioned, actually, in particular the online harms and also the mention of transnational repression, and look at transnational repression in a digital age. So the way that social media is being used to silence exiled journalists. Broadly defined, transnational repression is the practice, as I'm sure you know, of governments, often authoritarian ones, reaching across national borders to target opponents abroad with the aim of silencing their critics and maintaining their grip on power. Now, it's a term that's really gained currency in recent years. It's a bit of a buzzword around Parliament these days, for example, but the practice itself is, of course, not new. In the 20th century, many non-democratic countries used, in particular, their secret services to track down political opponents. A notable example that you're probably all familiar with would be the 1940 assassination of Leon Trotsky in Mexico City, for example. So it's not a new phenomenon in itself. Writers and journalists, unsurprisingly, given their frontline role in exposing the crimes of authoritarians, have also historically often been the targets of these kinds of attacks, including here in the UK. So as an example, in 1978, Bulgarian defector Georgi Markov was on his way home from BBC headquarters in central London, World Service headquarters in Aldwych, when he was stabbed with what he claimed was a poisoned umbrella, an event believed to have led to his death a few days later. So journalists have often been at the forefront of these kinds of attacks. The full extent of transnational repression taking place today is very difficult to pin down for a number of reasons. But according to the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe's Committee on Legal Affairs and Human Rights, extraterritorial acts of repression have reached an unprecedented level. And they're also taking place more openly as autocrats cooperate with one another and also seek to avoid international scrutiny. Non-governmental organisation Freedom House has published quite widely on this topic. It has recorded 854 direct physical attacks committed by 38 governments in 91 countries around the world since 2014, which includes 97 attacks, or about 11% of the total, on journalists. A caveat for those numbers, though, they are highly likely to represent a very small tip of a very big iceberg, but it gives you a kind of indication of the proportion of transnational repression which impacts journalists. Recent high-profile examples, which you may have come across, include the murder in Turkey of Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi in 2018, an attack in 2021 on Turkish journalist Erkal Kara in his Berlin apartment, and in 2023, the attempted poisoning in Germany of Russian journalist Yelena Kostychenko, to name but a few examples that have hit the headlines. But while direct physical attacks may be the most headline-grabbing, most visible form of attack, it's another type of threat I want to focus on today, one which slips more quietly into journalists' daily lives, but has an equally devastating impact on their journalism and also on their well-being, and that is intimidation delivered digitally, most often via social media. So over the next 10 minutes or so, I'm just going to give you a quick overview of the research we've been doing, what's happening for exiled journalists, and talk about the impact on those journalists, and then wrap up with a couple of ideas as to what needs to happen in order to stop the problem continuing to get worse. Digital technologies, including social platforms, of course, make it much easier for journalists in our day and age to report from a distance and also to reach audiences back in their countries of origin. As for all journalists, social platforms are an essential tool for journalists looking for news, looking for sources, looking for a platform also to share their work. But at the same time, social platforms, because it increases the reach of journalists, also makes the perceived threat of those journalists much greater to authoritarian leadership. And it also makes it easier than ever for authoritarians to pursue those journalists. And as a result, alongside more traditional methods that we've always seen of transnational repression, such as detentions, deportations, the harassment of family members, physical surveillance, travel bans, asset freezes, legal action, all of which still happen, what we also see today is digital harassment of journalists becoming a mainstay of transnational repression. I'm going to share with you the experiences of two groups of journalists based in the UK that we've been looking into this year, who are frequently subject to this kind of attack. The first group is exiled Iranian journalists who have long been in the crosshairs of Tehran. And the second are journalists who have quite newly arrived from Hong Kong, having fled a crackdown on independent media there that began in 2020. Both countries have terrible domestic press freedom records, as you may know. Iran was 177 out of 180 countries in RSF's World Press Freedom Index this year, and China was 178. Hong Kong itself came in at 140th. So it's perhaps not surprising to hear that China and Iran are also among the top 10 perpetrators of transnational repression worldwide. So let me start with Iran. We've been aware at RSF of online harassment of Iranian journalists for a long time. In 2020, we counted around 200 Iranian journalists living in countries including the United States, France, Germany, the Netherlands, Czechia, Sweden, who had received intimidatory messages online, around 50 of which were death threats. What we've done this year, though, is some more in-depth research to really better understand both the patterns of attack, the sorts of things that are happening, and also to look at the impact that those attacks are having on journalists and their journalism. So at RSF London, we conducted a survey and a series of in-depth interviews with dozens of Iranian journalists in the UK. We chose the UK specifically because there are 3 major Persian language broadcasters based in London. So we have hundreds of Iranian journalists operating from UK soil. And our research showed, which will be published in full next year, showed that almost 90% of UK-based journalists covering Iran had experienced online harassment or intimidation in the last 5 years, with social media being the primary conduit. So my first point is that this is not a rare phenomenon. It's institutionalized and it's systematic. 50% of the journalists we spoke to said they received threats, what they would consider frequently. So that's once a month or more. Many said they received them daily. Half of the respondents felt that the number of online threats had increased significantly in the past 5 years. As William mentioned in his paper, Iranian women, so women are particularly likely to be frequently abused online. 57% of female respondents said they received online harassment at least once a month, compared to 43% of men. And many of the messages received by women are gendered and sexualized, including rape threats, explicit images, attempts to besmirch their reputations. Respondents were sent images of genitalia, threats female family members would be raped. And in one case, the teenage son of a journalist was sent a pornographic image with his mother's face photoshopped onto it, causing immense distress for both the teenager and his parent. As well as overt abuse on social media, as well as sort of direct messaging publicly and privately, journalists also reported hacking incidents, phishing attempts, fake accounts, doxing, cyber attacks, again, generally delivered through their social media platforms. Now, for Iranian journalists, online intimidation appears to come from a range of sources, often accounts or individuals affiliated with the regime, but also sometimes from members of the opposition. So to Iranian journalists, it feels like they're under attack from all sides. Some attacks appear to be coordinated smear campaigns organized by very mobilized, highly mobilized activists. Others seem to be more personal. And even journalists who cover non-political subjects like sports or entertainment said they were targeted. Now, the impact of this kind of intimidation on journalists is huge. Indeed, for many, it's very overwhelming. 3/4 of the survey respondents told us that they experienced psychological stress, anxiety, feelings of vulnerability. Many said they relied on therapy, on antidepressants. Some couldn't sleep. One was suicidal. More than 60% said their family lives and relationships were impacted. 1/4 of them said they had to make changes to their daily routines. And many of them described living in a state of hypervigilance. And all of those things, as you can imagine, are compounded by a backdrop of stress at work. So threats tend to spike at times of turbulence in Iran, at times when the world's eyes are watching what's happening inside Iran. For example, the protests that followed the death of Mahsa Amini in September 2022, which are also, of course, the time for Iranian journalists that they're under the most pressure professionally, covering a story that's emotionally and physically very draining. Moving on to the experience quickly of journalists in Hong Kong, from Hong Kong. In terms of online harassment, over half survey respondents, again, told us that they received online abuse or threats linked to their journalism in the past 5 years. Some of the key problems Hong Kong journalists in the UK reported were trolling. Even stories on apparently innocuous subjects can trigger online trolls operating from a range of locations, including mainland China, Taiwan, Hong Kong. They received private messages from unknown sources, hacking of their social accounts, doxing, and a lot of impersonation as well, so fake accounts pretending to be them. China's modus operandi, though, is a little bit different to Iran's. Unlike Iran, who have these kind of large numbers of journalists working for big broadcasters who pose a more measurable risk, China doesn't tend to target large numbers of journalists directly. Instead, what China does is relies on the careful curation of a kind of overarching climate of fear, fed constantly by,
Fiona, 5 more minutes.
Perfect.
Thank you.
fed by low-level online abuse and occasionally high-profile emblematic attacks, such as the bounties which you may have seen that were put on the heads of Hong Kong activists, more of which were just announced today. So these kind of high-profile incidents feed the fear that then works extremely effectively. And that chilling effect really works. So fear is enough to impact journalists' well-being, even if they're not subject to direct attacks themselves. It impacts their willingness to continue reporting on Hong Kong, which of course is the aim of this kind of repression. It also has the added and highly damaging effect of deterring sources from engaging, so making it harder for journalists to continue doing their jobs and reporting. It leads to self-censorship, psychological exhaustion, submission to the will of the state, or ultimately sometimes withdrawal from the profession, precisely the effect it's intended to have. Again, with Hong Kong journalists, our survey respondents, a large proportion of them said they felt stressed or vulnerable, decreased productivity professionally, just that fear of retribution looming over every decision they take. Many of them use pseudonyms or write anonymously to protect themselves. And the directors of diaspora media platforms told us it's very hard to find journalists willing to write, certainly publicly. Very quickly, just in the last few minutes, to talk about the response of social media platforms, given that all this is happening on them. Journalists we spoke to have been overwhelmingly negative about the response of social media platforms and email providers to this kind of transnational repression. Multiple respondents across both communities said that complaints about abuse that they made to the platforms were either ignored or just dealt with in an unsatisfactory manner. Fake accounts are not removed, abuse messages and threats often hidden from the victim, from the journalist, but not from the general public. And this problem is particularly acute when messages are not written in English. So if you're complaining about messages of abuse that have been written in Farsi, for example, or in Chinese. Around 45%, so just under half of our survey respondents said that they had reported abusive content to platforms, but not one reported an adequate response, a response that they found properly supportive. So this is obviously a really big concern. Accompanying that is a police response that also tends to be lacking. So police tend to deal quite quickly, especially in the UK specifically, with large-scale physical attacks. So, for example, if some of you may be aware of what happened to Iran International earlier this year, they were forced to stop broadcasting because of security threats. In that kind of high-profile physical attack, police tend to respond very well. But when you have individual journalists going to talk about their experience on social platforms, online, the response is far more lackluster. They feel often sort of passed from pillar to post, ignored, not taken as seriously as they should. And as a final point, the reason that it's so important that we take this very seriously, online intimidation cannot be viewed in isolation from real-world attacks. Other studies have shown that online abuse is often a predictor of physical violence. Research by the International Centre for Journalists into online violence against women found that online abuse and physical attacks against women journalists, for example, are not only correlated, but causally related in many cases. So it's really important that we take this extremely seriously. So in summary, I know I'm out of time. So just to sort of summarize, digital repression is very much a new frontier for authoritarians, and nowadays part and parcel of the package of repression that travels across borders. In a world where journalists live and work increasingly online, it's imperative that we therefore find better ways, that government, that social platforms, that police find better ways to police cyberspace, so that crimes we would never accept in a physical workplace are not permitted to flourish online. I'll stop there, but very happy to take questions later on anything that we've mentioned.